Life and Works of Charles Alexander Eastman by Tim MacDonald. Eastman was born in 1858 in a Dakota Sioux village to a tribe that was on the run from the U.S. government. He learned the Native American ways, but then at the age of 15, moved to the East Coast and was educated. He became a doctor studying at Dartmouth. He was a star football player there. And later in his life, he worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, becoming a writer and eventually giving speeches across the country talking about things such as assimilation and Native American rights. Eastman was given the name Hakata at birth, as his mother had died shortly after he was born, and he was raised by his grandmother. Eastman worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and believed in assimilation, or that Native Americans needed to adapt to the Euro-American way of life. He also believed in things such as allotment, or that the Native Americans should get a set amount of land. And he placed a high emphasis on education for the Native Americans to assimilate. One of Eastman's most popular works was his first memoir, Indian Boyhood. This book was published in 1902, and in it he recounts his experiences growing up in a Dakota Sioux tribe and the lessons he learned from his elders, such as his uncle and grandma. It shows the struggles of growing up as Native American, such as facing things such as starvation and being forced to run hundreds of miles from the U.S. government. In one part of the book, his grandma heroically takes him across a river to get away from the U.S. government. But it also shows the civilization and beauty of Indians, such as his grandma's syrup-making process and the festivals they had with other tribes that featured things such as the cross and the picture shown on this slide. David Carlson gives a great scholarly analysis of this book and relates it to the time period in which it was written. He says that Eastman's audience was predominantly white, and so he writes the book for this audience. He presents it as a boy book, like books of the time such as Huckleberry Finn, and relates the Indian to a childish affinity for acting and role-playing in the process of identity formation. I tend to agree with Carlson's analysis of Indian Boyhood, and I think that while writing Indian Boyhood, Eastman looked at his audience of white Americans and had to write in their views to a certain amount in the book. There's a much larger debate going on about allotment and assimilation, and as I previously mentioned, Eastman was for this and worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was a boy book written for entertainment, and at times he calls Native Americans primitive and savage, but at the same time, this is his life, and I think throughout it, he paints these Native Americans as humans with a culture and with civilization. Eastman's second memoir was From the Deep Woods to Civilization, and it was a sequel to Indian Boyhood. In this book, Eastman talks about his transition from native life to the Euro-American life and how sometimes these two different cultures would clash, giving him a dual identity. In this book, Eastman is more critical of white civilization, and that's because I think his voice has grown stronger, and David Carlson agrees with that. One of the more interesting scholarly analyses I read was from Peterson, and he says, Rather than showing civilization's progress out of the darkness of the deep woods, Eastman denounces its savagery. Yet he continues to employ social Darwinistic language and places himself within our civilization and against primitive savagery. He invokes the moral outrage expected many pages earlier, following the massacre at Wounded Knee, but this passage is no less puzzling than the earlier one. A quote that I think sums up From the Deep Woods to Civilization best from Eastman is, "I'm an Indian, and while I've learned much from civilization for which I'm grateful, I've never lost my Indian sense of right and justice. I'm for development and progress along social and spiritual lines, rather than those of commerce, nationalism, or material efficiency. Nevertheless, so long as I live, I'm an American." Peterson points out the similarities with this belief to W.E.B. Du Bois' double consciousness, and I tend to agree with him. Eastman has struggled, but done successfully, to balance his Native American heritage and also his American citizenship, because he is an American. And through his different background, he's able to see that these Christians that he talks about in the text don't have stronger morals that they discuss than the Native Americans that he grew up with. And he's able to criticize Americans while recognizing at the same time that he is one and he is a part of the system now. Besides his autobiographical and nonfiction work, Eastman also Some of these writings were collected in his book, Red Hunters and the Animal People, which is a collection of these tales that Eastman heard growing up orally that were passed down from generation to generation. Animals such as wolves, bears, and deer are depicted in here, and a lot of these stories are allegorical. They're like fables. The Dakota Sioux way of life was a symbiotic relationship with animals, and the white settlers of the West did not share that relationship. In Pexa 664, he states, "Eastman's rhetorical purposes in the Little Boy Man story become evident, to educate certainly, but also to shame and thereby draw back into proper ethical relations those who broke their promise to act as a good relative should with generosity and sharing." These tales, while they could be considered just be fables, Pexa argues, were true to the Native Americans, and Eastman states that they believed them at the time, and this influenced and shaped their way of life. One prime example of the allegorical meaning in Red Hunters and the Animal People is the story On Wolf Mountain. On Wolf Mountain is about a pack of wolves whose land is encroached by a rancher. Now, prevailing stories at the time from people such as Ernest Thompson Seton in his book Lobo painted animals in a, animalistic nature, and Native Americans paint them in a much more human way. For example, in On Wolf Mountain, the story is from the wolf's perspective. The land belongs to the wolves because they're there first. And in this story, they discuss what to do about the hunter. Unlike Ernest Thompson Seton's story, where the hunters discuss and then hunt down the wolves for the ranchers. I think it's important to point out that Eastman includes how the Native Americans had a symbiotic relationship with wolves, in that the wolves would go hunt with the Native Americans, and then the Native Americans would give them a cut of their meat. They weren't some ancient relic that the hunters had no choice to kill because they were on their land. In conclusion, while Eastman promotes assimilation in his stories, he still stands up for the Native American way of life, their culture, their morals. and does this successfully through his writing.